So,
Okay. Okay.
here we go.
Yeah.
Vlad, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to LodgeCast.
Thank you very much. It's
Working
been,
title.
I think it's a great title. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's been like in production for a while.
Right.
I've been thinking about it for a while, but now we're actually doing it. Now we're here.
Mm,
So,
mm.
was there anything in particular you were feeling about?
Well, I thought I'd start off by saying why I was so excited about coming on, because I have this deep feeling deep inside me that you are going to become this amazing megastar in
Oh
media. And
no.
so, yeah, so I thought by being on your first podcast, I get some claim to fame over this. That's really the only reason I'm excited. I'm
Oh
norm-
God. That's
normally,
that's put some pressure on me now for the rest of my career.
I'm usually quite introverted, so for me, this is not the thing that I typically am drawn towards.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you. Thank you for signing up. So
it's a
introverted, yet
pleasure.
you're the first one.
Mm,
Jump
mm,
straight into it.
yeah.
Oh dear. What what career do you think I would end up in? Podcast.
I There's just something about you. I don't know. I'm not necessarily podcasting, and I'm not a clairvoyant. I can't see the precise path, but certainly somewhere in media. Somewhere where broadcasting and media is where I envisage you. I think you've got the right personality traits and characteristics. Yeah, to be to be watchable or listenable. Is listenable a word?
Listenable. Sure, it is
Should be.
now.
If it's not, it should be.
Added into the dictionary.
Yes.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, that's a bit. What about you? What are you doing? What's your career? You do medicine, right?
Yeah, that's right. I've had a few weeks off now as part of this coronavirus lockout,
Mm.
and medical students, unfortunately, are locked out as well. But we're going back on Tuesday, so I'm really looking forward to that. Um, it's been a long stay at home,
Mm.
and the books are very different to the patients, so it'd be nice to get in there again, despite feeling inadequate most of the time. Nonetheless, it's an important learning thing. Yeah, yeah. I think they're just figuring out precisely what's going to happen, but we do have a solid date finally. We've been trying to get to that date. Now we're here.
Mm. Interesting. So do you want to chat about you? I want to get to know you more. I know we've spoken a bit here and there in between, camp and training and all this, but
Yeah.
we haven't like delved into you, like Vlad Marinov.
Mm,
Who is
mm.
who is Vlad?
That's a good question. And you're right. We have spoken on a handful of occasions, and I think each time it was positive. It was a little rapport and a bond or whatever. So yeah, I certainly felt that. So again, I wasn't hesitating to come onto this program.
Thank you.
um, well, I think like all people, it's complicated. It's hard to answer in a sentence or two. I think there's one like preloaded for most people. Preloaded answers to who they are, and it usually rotates around what they do for most of the day. Like, I'm an accountant or a lawyer or a student or a medical student or whatever. But of course, there's so much more to people. And I think people kind of get caught up in that image of who they think they are.
Mm,
Mm.
yeah, that's for certain. So apart from medical student, what are you?
Well,
Give me some adjectives.
I'm a son
Uh,
and a partner
yeah.
and a friend. And I do a bunch of things that I think are useful in the world. Well, I like to think they're useful. I spent a bit of time working in the recovery community, like the drug and alcohol recovery community in Canberra.
Mm,
So I invest a lot of my time there. And obviously, as you know, I'm into meditation. Um, I'm in the Vipassana tradition of meditation, so I do that quite a bit and go on retreats I was in India last year, as I think we've talked about previously. I spent,
I think you mentioned you were in India last year.
yeah, I took a year off from medical school and
That's
went,
right.
went to India to deepen my practice.
Mm.
Yeah, so that was quite an adventure. Yeah, yeah,
I'm fascinated in that. Do you mind talking about the meditation? We
yeah.
can
Sure.
delve into that because I've like been on the edges. I've done a bit
Mm,
of mindfulness, during like high periods of stress. Like, I mean, for me, it was the HSC a couple of years ago. That was the
mm,
peak for me. And that was when I was really just doing like the breathing and the focus in.
mm,
Is that what you do, or
mm.
like what's like your meditation practice?
Well, it's kind of evolved over time. It's a great question. It's evolved over time. I think I first got interested in Buddhism more generally, probably in my mid-adolescence. So maybe when I was 15, 16,
Hmm.
I started reading a lot of books about it. And really it was something that I couldn't really access because of all the tradition and the cultural and social barriers that were in place for me to access it. And I think I was also put off by the whole range of kind of dogmatic beliefs that are, at least in the Buddhism that I was exposed to. So, and meditation was in there. So there's something about it that I've always found interesting. And then when I went to uni, I started off doing law and international relations,
Hmm.
and I started to really not like what I was doing. I was really not enjoying it. I think I did the course for all the wrong reasons. It just fit my grades rather than what I actually wanted to do with my life. And so I got really depressed and anxious, and I just didn't want to do that with my life. So I kind of dropped out. And then for a couple of years there, I went back to Sydney where I grew up and worked in bars and worked in the cross and stuff. And got exposed to a lot of kind of party life, like hedonistic type of pursuits, like
Hmm.
how I can just make myself feel better quickly. And there's a range of ways that one can make themselves feel better quickly. And and that kind of all came crashing down. It was a conclusion for me that there was nothing in it. There's no substance, there's no person, there's no behavior that is really going to quash that hole that's inside me. Sounds kind of poetic, but that's kind of how I've always felt growing up. There's something not quite right. It wasn't bad, it was just something not quite right.
Hmm.
So I tried to fill it with all sorts of things, and eventually I stumbled on my first kind of proper experience in meditation, which was through MBSR, which is mindfulness-based stress reduction, and that was pioneered by John Kabat-Zinn back in the 1970s. He was a Harvard-trained doctor who went to Japan to practice Zen Buddhism, and then found something therapeutic there, came back to the United States, stripped all the Buddhism off, all the dogma, and just kept the technique.
Hmm.
And that's what I was first introduced to. And that's an 8-week program that you can do here in Canberra with a psychologist. They do it in groups. You can do it all over the world now. It's an enormous amount of research has been published. In fact, most of the research that we read about meditation is usually based around MBSR, like it reduces anxiety or et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so the list is very long and growing rapidly. So most of that
Hmm.
is based around MBSR. So I did that for a couple of years, developed a practice, and began to see some of the kind of the benefits that you spoke about. So I was definitely more present in the day, more centered, more relaxed. My anxiety was lower, and that kind of meaninglessness of life was lifting. It hadn't lifted, but it was lifting.
Hmm.
And that's when I decided to do med. And you can't just get straight into medicine. At least not from me. My grades in the final semester or 2 semesters really before I left were pretty bad, because I was so unmotivated. So I came back to uni and did a science degree and transferred into the PhD once my grades were good enough. Um, yeah, and so that was kind of at the same time as the meditation. But then I saw that I really wanted to I really wanted to figure out what was it that Kabat-Zinn saw in Zen Buddhism. Like, what was the original teaching, if you like,
Mm.
because it seemed to me that it was pretty diluted. 15 minutes here, 20 minutes there. Just, yeah, it just didn't seem like it was. It was obviously beneficial, but there must be so much more.
Mm.
I'm getting one cylinder when I could be getting six. Where's the rest of it? And is all the belief stuff necessary? I mean, I would later learn that most of my understanding of Buddhism really came from a type of Mahayana Buddhism, which is predominant in Southeast Asia, which is very different to Theravada Buddhism, which is comes around India and Nepal and Burma, which is much less dogmatic.
Mm.
Anyway, so I started exploring, and that's when I stumbled into my current tradition, which is Vipassana, which is a Theravada Buddhist tradition. Which requires no belief at all, just direct experience, and is a bit more intensive in those techniques that I taught in MBSR. Yeah, so I started getting more involved and started going on retreats for 10-day meditation retreats. That was maybe 5 years ago was my first retreat, 5.5 years ago. And it kind of went from there. And then when I came into medicine, it was everything I wanted.
Mm.
Yeah, it was like I've worked for 4 years through a bachelor's and my honors, determined to reach this goal. And I got in, and you would think I'd be so happy, right? And I remember I was on Northbourne and I was driving, and everything had fallen precisely how I wanted it to fall. And there was the hole, still there. And it became really clear to me, and it can be clear intellectually and it can be clear on an experiential level. And it became clear to me on an experiential level that not only was there no way to get happiness by going out and filling my desires, that was not going to work, but nor was it really going to be achieved by attaining kind of external goals. That's not to say that external goals aren't good, because I think it's very worthwhile to pursue
It's helpful
goals.
to have something to work towards.
Absolutely. But if I was looking to fill the hole, then it's not going to happen through that medium. And I could see that, I could see myself, finishing, having a family, becoming proficient in whatever branch of medicine I decided to dedicate my life. I could see that none of that was really going to fill the hole. I needed to do that work on my own and deeply. And that's kind of when the idea of India started to, the seed was planted around that time. And for the first 2 years of medicine are traumatic to anyone. It doesn't really matter what your background, but it was very, very tough for me because I was kind of in this lost phase as well. Like, I know I want to do this. There's nothing else in the world I want to do with my life. But I thought this was going to fix me. And I know it's not, so it was a difficult couple of years. And I think the kind of the caveat of that is that it eventually got better, I guess. I took that year off. It was a hard decision. It's not everybody takes a year off in the middle of medical school. I mean, in a general way, you're advised against it. Depends who you talk to, but that's the general advice. Others would think it's a good idea. But I went with the option to take a year and deepen my practice and figure out what I can do to become really embedded in it and make it a lifelong thing. Gosh, that was me talking for a while.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Did you have any big revelations, big discoveries in India?
I think the biggest discovery is getting to know myself better. Yeah, I think we touched on this idea that many people live with this kind of avatar about who they are. The lawyer, the doctor, whatever it is that they do, or the husband, the son, etc. And we kind of live out this script. We're handed this script from our parents and from society, and it's reinforced in large part by our genetics. If you're good at maths and your parents think you should be an engineer, and before you know it, you want to be an engineer, and then here we are 40 years later, and you're an engineer working in whatever area of engineering. So the biggest revelation was that, if I look back over my life, I can see how things fell into place in a certain way, and it led me to where I am now. I'm not the architect of my own mind. I just inherited it through a series of environmental influence and my genetics, and that's how I got here. And India for me was really an opportunity to take a sufficient amount of time, and it takes, I think, a sufficient amount of time to be with myself, to figure out who I am in a much greater detail than I had previously done. Yeah, I think most people have an idea of who they are, but it's often guided by this sense of self or identity or ego, to use a Freudian term. I mean, I think many branches of both science and philosophy talk about this core concept using different vocabulary. But yeah, it's an illusionary self, because the present moment, the one that's here now, that's the one that's is worthwhile grasping.
It's very coincidental part, sort of. I don't know if that's the right word for it. I just started watching a new TV series called Devs. I don't know if you've heard about it.
No, I'm not familiar. Sorry.
And it's a science fiction series. I've only just started, so I don't know where it's going to go from here. But it grapples with free will and determinism. And in the first episode, one of the main characters, specifically, he delivers this monologue where he explains that to this other character. He says, this action that you're doing now was not your choice. You never had a choice. It was through your entire life growing up. It was from what your parents said. It was from your genetics. It was where you were born, how you were raised. It was determined. This choice was determined for you to make this choice now. Choice that they made. And I thought, like, that's a very interesting concept of, like, how much do we actually have control over what we do, and how much is just something that we would have done because of the way we grew up.
Yes, and I think it's an age-old question. It goes back to the ancient Greeks and Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. It's a widely discussed idea. And, one of the benefits of philosophy is, I guess, you don't have to come to a conclusion. But I think from a scientific point of view, free will is absolutely an illusion. I mean, why would we suddenly, in any point in time, be free to make a decision? It's just basic physics. Something precedes something else. Nothing is just born into it. And energy isn't just created out of nowhere. Thought is preceded by all the brain processes that have come before, and those were shaped by the ones that came before. I think the reason it's so deeply unsettling is twofold. First, because it makes us feel very powerless, if that's the case, on an individual level. And secondly, because our entire civilization, Western civilization, is premised on the capacity for free will. I mean, you go to jail because you chose to commit a crime, right? And despite this kind of insight, people are quite comfortable in saying, well, there's a 13-year-old boy who grew up in an abusive family, had a horrendous background, and now he stole a car. We're happy to say, well, he's not really responsible for that. He's had a terrible life. But we're not happy to say that somebody's become extremely successful for similar background reasons that led them to that point of success. So it's a real kind of double standard that we have almost about free will. We're happy to take it on where it's convenient to us. but we're not when it comes either to ourselves or to positive things we see around us and in society. So I think it's fascinating. I don't think that accepting that we don't have any free will is disempowering. I think it's more about, if you've gathered sufficient information about your environment, you can put in place mechanisms that will, in time, lead to better outcomes. So, for instance, let's suppose you decided to get an education. So you got an education as a result of, perhaps not your own will. And part of that education was exercise. You learned how to play tennis. And now that intervention in your life has led you to playing tennis your whole life and staying more fit and more physically healthy. And as a result, you lived a longer life. So I don't think it's about in the moment. I think it's much more about putting in place appropriate interventions that we have gathered insight of what those interventions should be from our environment. So it's not a clear-cut free will, but it is a type of intervention that's possible, and it links very nicely with meditation. In that when one sits down to meditate, you're just taking a pause from any action, any physical action. You're just allowing things just to be expressed. So when I sit, for an hour or so, I experience all the physical sensation that comes up, all the thoughts that go through my mind, and by practicing a concentration, like focusing on my breath, for instance, over time, you get to just observe the nature of the mind, just how crazy it is, all the things that pop in there over time. Yeah. So yeah, I'm not a subscriber of free will. It's a deeply uncomfortable truth, but all the evidence suggests otherwise. However, I shouldn't completely discard the opposing view. I think there's many people who feel otherwise, and including people who have dedicated their life to this question. But having examined both sides of the argument, both in philosophy and in neuroscience, it seems to me that free will is a convenient delusion of the Western mind.
That's a very poetic way of putting it. You have a very poetic way of putting things.
Oh, well, thanks.
I've found you're able to soften the blow.
Well, think of the implications. Yeah,
it will be massive.
That's right. I mean, entire criminal justice system, for instance, would need to be completely revolved. Suddenly, the pedophile is not at fault, for instance. You see what I mean? The implications are gigantic. Not to say that certain people shouldn't be removed from society because they're a danger to others. There's certainly a small percentage of people that are like that. Have people who are very high in psychopathy, for instance. But the majority of people incarcerated in our system, both here and abroad, in the Western world at least, have had very unfortunate lives, and really are victims of their circumstances rather than, conniving criminals as portrayed in the media or elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you see it in America with just like the incarceration rates between African Americans versus white citizens of the US. It's just the area you were born in determines so much of your life. It can determine your income level, your education levels, incarceration. There's so much to it just because you were born, and you don't choose where you're born. That's one thing, like definitively, like putting aside the question of whether we have any choice at all. Say you do have choice in the rest of your life, you don't choose where to start your life.
Absolutely.
That's one thing that is definitely not a choice to yourself, and you've got to make the most within that situation.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I had a thought in my mind just then, but it just escaped me.
Oh no. Hopefully it comes back.
Hopefully. It was a relevant thought.
Oh no. Should we backtrace?
No, it's okay.
Okay. We'll keep going. But free will, I don't know, it's a toughie. It's a toughie.
Yeah, and for anyone who's listening, who's interested, there's people who speak on it and write about it, obviously much more eloquently than I have, but and certainly present the opposing argument much better than I have. Yeah.
There's some good courses in it too at the ANU.
Is that right? We
Yeah,
should do.
because I've done a couple of philosophy courses as part of politics. Like lots of like fundamentals, introduction sort of stuff to philosophy. So it's like a little snippet of all the different topics, but one that keeps coming up is like the free will choice. How much freedom do you have, you know? And what is freedom exactly? So like, are you free if you have two choices? Are you free if you have two choices and you're not threatened by something, you know, all those sort of different thresholds to it as well.
I think what swung me was the modern contribution to this debate, and that modern contribution has been data. You know, for the first time, we can begin to calculate the factors and then make population level analysis, just as you alluded to with, or rather specified with incarceration rate in the United States between blacks and whites. I mean, we've got the data to pool now, so it's not just a philosophical debate. We can look at specific factors, specific variables, and their input on their life. Like, how much trajectory difference is there between somebody born in the same postcode, but one went to a private school versus one went to a state school? You know, otherwise level on every, let's say they both had an IQ test at a certain age. We know they're equally intelligent, and suddenly they have very different life outcomes, as an example. Yeah, so I think that the data is what ultimately threw me. Yeah.
It has its way.
Yes.
The numbers have their way.
Yeah, people find it kind of defeating, but the flip side of it is it's so liberating. You know, you're not really in charge. I mean, there can be a very liberating thought. You know, things are going to happen. You're just kind of bearing witness. That doesn't mean you don't put in effort, you don't do what you're going to do, because you're going to do that anyway. It doesn't mean you don't pursue your path, whatever that is, don't make mistakes, don't fall in love, etc. It just means that there's less pressure. Things are going to unfold as they unfold.
There's also a comfort in it when you look back. So after the fact, when something happened, you know that that was going to happen no matter what you did. That was still going to happen to you. So you can sort of be comfortable in knowing like that just would have happened. I couldn't have controlled that situation because it was out of my control. I didn't have a choice that was going to happen. But I'm still here after that event, and I've learned from it, because even if you don't have choice, it's still the first time it's happening to you.
Yes.
You're still learning from these experiences. You're still
and
developing. You're still growing from it. Exactly. Like, even if like every single thing, like, you know, you're going to get married at, 26, and you're going to have your first child at 28, and you're going to lose your job at 33. Like, even if all of that was already mapped out, you're still going to experience that, and you still learn from that. It's still the first time for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know. There's some comfort in that.
And I think it's okay to switch between the two sides as well. You know, I mean, there's points in the day when I definitely have all the will in the world, or at least I appear to, but only upon reflection and contemplation is the illusion visible. Otherwise, of course, I feel in everyday matters like I'm making a choice to cook dinner or making a choice to go to class. It's not like something that I can really truly appreciate. It's more only when we have a conversation like this, can I really draw on it? Or in meditation is another way. Yeah.
Well, I think that's like how you said, whether it's true or not, if we have free will, it still feels like we do.
Yes,
it
absolutely.
Still feels like it. So if it feels like it, then who's to say whether it's true or not for you? You know, if you think, if you feel like you have free will, then you have free will, you know, like that's the argument that most people will make. And that's perfectly reasonable. If it feels like it, then sure, it's true. Like, it's the same thing. Like, if I see that there's colored pencils on my desk, then there's colored pencils on my desk, you know? It's just that sort of sensory thing. And if you feel like you have the choice, then you have the choice. You can't argue with your own feeling. You can't try to fight that unless you start really delving deep into like the subject like we are now.
Yes, yes. And I would add that in this process of getting to know ourselves better, when we begin to see the things that led up to us being who we are, the result is that the free will idea is extinguished or becomes less, more obvious as an illusion rather. And those things can be lifted. Like if you see that the reason that, I'm just making this up, obviously, the reason that you swear too much is because your dad used to swear too much, and you don't need to swear anymore. Otherwise you're kind of on autopilot and you're just swearing. Now replace swearing with complex human behavior, the way you treat other people, that you didn't just kind of invent stuff. You inherited it from environment and genetics, and only in seeing it clearly as coming from somewhere through self-reflection can change. Really profound change can happen in a person's life. And I should also add that meditation or mindfulness doesn't have exclusive domain over this idea. There's many ways to become more aware and understand yourself better. Notably psychotherapy is very effective. Anything really that allows you time to get to know yourself. So yeah, I don't want to make it seem like meditation is like the final word on the matter or the best path. I just found it most compatible for me.
Yeah, it's been interesting. Mindfulness has sort of exploded in these recent years, I feel.
It has, and excuse me for 1 second. I'm just going to pop the battery on charge. It's going a bit flat. Okay. It has, and within mindfulness circles, it's kind of called a mindfulness. I think there's different levels at which one can practice, not unlike sport. I think that most of the stuff that's out for the general public at the moment is kind of like do a sit-up or do a push-up. There's certainly improvement, but it's better to do a push-up than not to. But if you really want to get to know yourself better and improve the function of your mind, then it's going to take a bit more. And it's going to take a consistent effort. And with mindfulness, it's a daily practice that's required. With various degrees of intensity as you progress. So starting off lightly and then moving forward. I'm not unique in my position in that I think one day we will see mindfulness or mind training the same way we see exercise today. We think that as a society, exercise is very beneficial and you should be doing it. And it's kind of crazy not to. Particularly when you hit a certain age, and exercise is just something that you need to be doing if you want to maximize your chances of having a good life, good physical life. But in the 1950s and 60s, no one thought that. People were just smoking and drinking whiskey, after work. I mean, the only people doing any kind of exercise were people in the circus. The guy with the mankini on and doing the weights. That's the only guy who's doing
big
weights.
mustache and
That's the only guy doing it. So I think in time, and I think that's what we're experiencing. I think it's infancy of where this is headed. I think it's getting better. I mean, you look at where we've come from, say 20 years ago, or in the 90s and the 2000s, mindfulness has exploded, and more people are taking it more seriously. But I think the mindfulness stuff, the coloring in mindfully or whatever, I'm sure it has some application, but it's not really what the mind training is about. Yeah.
I think there's I was just going to say, I think there's like that border between how much of it is actual mindfulness and how much is just like a new de-stress mechanism.
Yes.
So like I color in, but I just color in to de-stress.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's just to have some away time from the screen, put my phone away and just de-stress. It's not really doing a lot for the actual focusing of the mind and all that sort of stuff that you speak of.
Yeah, yeah, and it's to take nothing away from these techniques that people find beneficial. It's not to say that they're useless. It's just to say that there's different levels of
Mm,
approach. Yeah, yeah. Anything really to, if you find it beneficial, then it's absolute. I know I would find it beneficial if I got into it. I'm sure, because I've seen some of the work that people have done. It's pretty cool. Uh, yeah, yeah. I think we're kind of beginning to take it more seriously. You see it a bit in Silicon Valley. People are beginning to see it, take it more seriously there, and I think that has ripple effects in the culture.
mm,
I think uh, most recently the CEO of Twitter went on a Vipassana retreat in Burma for 10 days, and that got a lot of people thinking. So I think we're in a process. I don't think that we'll be where we are now in 10 years' time.
mm.
And a good guide of that is if we look back 10 years, it would come an enormous way. So I think it's a bit of a phase where we're at. Yeah.
So are you the Roger Federer of mindfulness?
Oh, not at all. Not. I mean it sincerely, without any false humility. I really am just beginning a path.
Yeah.
That may sound inconsistent with the amount of focus I have, but it's it really is the job of a lifetime. You know, I mean, I think some people, just like with physical ability, some people are gifted to begin with. You know, like
Mm,
I could train for basketball for the rest of my life every day, and I'm never going to be in the NBA. You know, it's just not going to happen. And mindfulness or meditation is really no different. There's immediate benefits to playing basketball all the time, to me, but to reach that kind of Roger Federer level, as you pointed to as an example, is absolutely impossible for me. I think I will continue. I think as long as I can, as long as I'm able, because I see the fruits of it in my life. But my intention is to kind of the equivalent in sport or in physical exercise, to be fit and healthy, rather than to achieve any kind of nirvana,
mm.
for lack of a better word. Yeah.
It's fascinating. I'm fascinated by mindfulness. It's
Mm.
yeah, it's something that like the effects of it, I think, are really beneficial.
I think it's not uninteresting why it is a particular type of person that is
Mm,
that finds themselves interested, and it's typically, this is purely my own experience and just my observation and conclusion based on no data. But if I look at people in my life who are interested in mindfulness, and people I've met over my life, and people who are just interested, and people who do it very seriously, the one thing they seem to have in common is they're not really sold on the idea that on the ideas that our culture tells us is gonna make it all better.
mm,
You know, like they're just not sold that. You know, currently in our culture, it's all about wealth, power, sex appeal. You know, I think it's people who are deep down know that that can't be it, and they have various backgrounds, various levels of educations, very different ages. But it seems to be that is the kind of the underlying kind of discomfort that people feel in themselves, that leads to mindfulness practice. Yeah, yeah,
I'll
that's
take
definitely
that
an
as a
observation.
compliment.
I think it is. I think traditionally, I mean, classically, you would refer to these people as, you know, quote unquote seekers.
Mm,
You know, and that they've been described throughout human history. You know, people who are just, something's not right here. This can't be the full picture, and then I'm going to find out. And meditation sounds like a reasonable way to figure it out, or to at least get a somewhat of a better picture. Because we spend all our lives looking outside, all our living days looking out, never looking in. There's a whole universe in there that we just completely ignore. Mm.
yeah. It's I mean, I question a lot. I doubt, and I entertain different arguments. That's just always been something about me. That's probably why I do politics and, you know, dabble in a bit of philosophy and all of this. Is just constantly searching for that like why this or why that sort of thing, and looking into the deeper arguments, you know. So is it something about like just constantly in the search for something else?
Yeah, the answers. You know, where are the answers?
Mm,
What are the answers? I think that's kind of it. And I think that's what drew me into political science as well, is that it seems like the answers are in global governance. Like, who are the rulers of the world and how does the international system work, both politically and economically and socially? That's what drew me in initially. Um, I mean, for me personally, I just felt that this isn't it. This is not enough. And kind of what drew me into medicine as a later is, what can I do on my scale? Because in my mind it was just stuck that Australia is a middle power. We have some jurisdiction over our neighbourhood. Over the
New
South
Zealand
Pacific.
and
Yes,
the
yes,
islands.
that's right. So
That's about it. Yeah.
I really wanted to make an impact in the world, and I just didn't feel that I could do it through political science. Well, one, I'm not born in Australia, but even by some miracle, if I was to rise up and to be, assisting the Prime Minister through Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, it doesn't take away from the fact that our role in the global arena is very, very limited. And I really didn't want to just take orders for the rest of my life. So it felt like the conclusion I drew in my mid-20s was that a more pragmatic, direct impact on people's life is where I will put my energy. Yeah, but I think if one is pivoted towards political science and making an impact in that way, then that's great. And I think there's a lot of impact to be made. So I'm not taking anything away from that. Just simply for me, considering my skills or talents or whatever, then it's not best used there. That was kind of the conclusion that I drew. Yeah.
Interesting. Are you a globalist?
A globalist?
A globalist.
Oh, globalist. I think I absolutely am. I think if you look into the future of our species, our issues are global. So I think that having an international system that is coherent is absolutely necessary. I kind of subscribe to the way Yuval Harari writes about it, and that's having an international system that's a little bit like a sports league. You have different teams, but we're all playing the same rules. So, you can play Arsenal and come from the Sydney FC, and we're all the same rules apply. So even though we're different actors and one could be stronger than the other. So a strong international system is absolutely essential in my mind to tackle some of the issues ahead. Some of the issues that are here now, let alone ahead. And I think that with the near unilateral withdrawal of American leadership from the global stage, I think what little international order we had, spearheaded by the Americans after the Second World War, is collapsing. I mean, most recently, I don't know if we want to get into this topic, but President Trump withdrawing funding from the WHO, and the irony struck me. I mean, these institutions set up by the Americans after the war to project soft power, to establish an international order, which they headed, by the way. They had every advantage. That's why they're the biggest donor, not because they're so generous. And then to withdraw and then blame the WHO, I just think the irony is striking. Yeah.
Yeah, I asked that question because when you talked about Australia's place, and like, we are small, we don't have a lot of say internationally. Regionally, sure. Internationally, we don't. I found it very interesting when you said, like, you didn't really see a path through politics in that way for Australia. Whereas, like, because I do politics and I'll probably end up somewhere in the field at some point. I don't know where. It's, I have all the choices. But...
Oh, do you?
Or do I? Exactly.
No,
but I saw with Australia, I'm much more domestic focused when it comes to studying politics. I look at what happens just within the one country. And that's not to deny that internationally, there is a whole regime, and we need to focus a lot more on the international system as a whole and global cooperation. But that's not happening right now. As you said as well with the US, it's this sort of refocusing back to each country for themselves. And there's just so much that still happens within each country that then elevates to what happens on the international stage. So like
Mm.
the US's retraction from its position in the world is because of what's happened within the country. It's the domestic situation which drove the international decision making. And I
Yes.
think that's what sort of draws me to politics, is the fact that it's still what happens on the domestic level that drives the international level.
Mm.
And I don't know, maybe one day we'll get to a point where it's the other way around. Maybe the international system will become much more powerful, that it can determine what happens within individual states to this sort of power that domestic decisions has on international level at the moment, you know?
Mm.
So,
So I guess in those previous comments, I should make clear that it's extremely important to pay attention to domestic politics and to be involved. We're a sovereign state, and naturally the decisions that we make as a population have an enormous impact on our quality of life. And not just our quality of life, but our very survival. But I think what I was more referring to are the almost existential kind of issues that are facing humanity. And in that domain, Australia can play an important role, but just not a leadership role from a power perspective. So I see Australia a little bit like Sweden or Norway. You know, they can really show the way. They can set an example. So if we look at something like climate change, you know, our lack of leadership around this issue is very is a very poor choice because of the example it sets in the world. You know, people look to Australia to offer some moral guidance, not necessarily power dynamic guidance. Sure, Australia's contribution to, as the Liberal Party keeps insisting, is whatever it is, 1% to the global system. It's really not about that. It's about moral leadership. So yeah, I think that paying attention to domestic politics is very important. But the issues like climate change, like you know, nuclear weapons around the world, particularly the rise of information technology, whether it's through artificial intelligence, robotics, these are the gigantic issues that are going to define this century. And Australia's role as a nation state in influencing the decisions that come about there is limited. So only from that perspective. So as you say, from a globalist perspective, do I see our role? But in saying all of that, I see myself as a global citizen. You know, we're all in on this, and in particular, as a citizen of the Western civilization. You know, I think the liberal ideals that we've inherited from the Renaissance and have spread out over the Western world are in decline. And with American withdrawal from global leadership, I think what we're seeing is the rise of powers whose ideology is not consistent with ours and is a real threat to those principles that we hold fundamentally true and, you know, to use the phrase, God-given. You know, the simple liberties that are really under threat from a change in dynamic in the global order, which is what we're seeing now. I mean, even right on our doorstep as coronavirus hits, we see China replacing the role of the Americans in using soft power, you know, sending out aid, for instance, and conditional aid, you know, kind of a neo-colonialism of African states. Yeah, even in our own backyard in Vanuatu, it's all been widely reported. But yes, this new change in dynamics is a threat to our system. Yeah, and a threat to those ideas. Yeah.
I mean, China's filling the gap that the US is leaving behind. And when you look at it, like, look, if you want to take a very, not ignorant, but very shallow view of it, you could say, well, it's good, you know, China's giving the foreign aid that the US isn't, you know, it's still supporting these countries. But like you said, there's these extra caveats that are being put on it, which is sort of twisting. It's like you said, it's tearing away little by little at like those Western liberties, those sort of rights that we hold so dear. And China's just slowly twisting like within these countries to pull away from that. and
mm,
change
mm.
certain institutions away from that. And I mean, there was a chance in history where it could have been a lot better. The US and China could have worked together on this to create
Yeah,
a new order, you know?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it can be traced back to the 1970s, but just before we touch on that, I mean, the real threat isn't so much about China having more power in the world, in my mind, but more about if you look at Chinese society today and the type of institutions that are at work, those will become the norms, just as like they did with the United States. You know, when the United States took over the world as a global hegemon following the Second World War, their ideals often, you know, often they were hypocritical. I mean, they were happy to take out a democratically elected leader in El Salvador or Honduras or all over their geographic backyard, but at least the ideals were in place. You know, there was a goal, there was a path towards what we kind of wanted, even if we weren't delivering that. I'm sure the people that were making those decisions were being not so much Machiavellian as realpolitik, you know, thinking that this is the way to ensure those liberal ideas live in the long term. Sometimes we just have to pull the lever too hard. So I'm not, I'm not trying to be critical of historical figures, but rather that the norms that will be replaced are those that are now in place in China. And that is that, you know, the nation state is more important. Individual freedom should be second to the interest of the group. You know, fundamentally different ideas to ours. That, you know, dissent is not something that should be widely should be expressed. Sorry, I'm just, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking, am I ever going to get a Chinese visa again after saying this? Are they going to ever let me into China? And that is exactly
To
actually
be
what I'm
asking that
talking about.
question is...
That's right. I paused in what I was saying because there was a genuine concern that my expressing some kind of what can be perceived as anti-Chinese, and when I say anti-Chinese, not the people, of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the people, but the system, the political system in place, was somehow have repercussions for me. And right now there may be less, and in time there'll be much, much more. Plenty of journalists, for instance, are refused entry into China because they're seen as anti-establishment over there. And same with Russia.
Yeah,
absolutely. If I was to, these very same ideas that I'm talking about here can be applied to Russia in much the same way. So yeah, it's a brave new world.
You're from Russia, aren't you?
Yes, I was born in Moscow.
You were born in Moscow. What's your connection still to Russia?
Well, my father still lives there, my aunt, and that's the only family I have that's alive over there. Who I'm in regular contact with, obviously. Yeah.
You still get back often, or?
I try to go once a year. And on the way, I try to stop in somewhere because it's quite literally on the other side of the world. Like if you put a line through where Sydney is and then you match it to Moscow on the other end of the globe, then it's almost the exact opposite end.
Yeah.
So that's facilitated some travel opportunities for me because I try to just stop in somewhere on the way, including China, for instance. Yeah. But as a side effect of that, I haven't seen much of North America because I fly the other way.
Yeah, it's sort of opposite ends.
Yeah. But I do visit, and Russia is a fascinating place with its own deep history, not unlike China, and an unfortunate history of leadership, to say the least. I think the Russian people deserve better, but you know, time will tell.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do know that I know that feeling of being distant from family because my mum's family is from Germany, and her family, like her parents, are still over there. My uncle and his family are over there. So being like the other side of the world, I understand that long travel, the long flights. Like when we would travel as a family, we didn't have many like stopovers. We sort of just went from Australia to Germany. So like 30-hour trip. I know that sort
Yes.
of exhaustion. So to break it up with some other travel in between, that's a smart move.
Yeah. Well, also the cheapest flights usually have 50,000 stopovers. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, it is hard when your family's far away, but you grow up faster, stand on your own too faster. So I think every situation has excuse the quote, but a silver lining. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've learnt so much after all my trips to Germany, like being immersed in that culture for, like, even if it was only 6-7 weeks every 3 years, but that was as I was growing up, that was when I was 1, when I was 4, when I was 6 years old, when I was 10 years old, 13 and 15. So those ages, that was from 18 months after I was born until towards the end of my high school life, I had constant visits to Germany.
And
And
it sounds like these weren't mere Kentucky bus tour
no,
visits. This was an immersion into the culture.
this was being in a city and living there for 6 weeks and visiting the family and going to the supermarket all the time and going to these little secret other restaurants and cafes that only my mum, who grew up in this city, knew. And as we were sitting there in like the beer garden, and she would be telling me stories of when she was 20 years old, what she was doing at this very spot. It's a very different way of seeing the other side of the world by having like this much closer connection to it. And I feel really connected to Germany. And I mean, like, I am literally with my family, but just like the experience of it and that perspective is very different to what someone who would go like on those river cruises through the Rhine or something.
Yes.
It's a very different perspective than me going to Munich because my mum's old work colleagues are there.
Yes.
It's a much different experience to see the world.
Yes. And that part of the world is a part of you. It's not just, these are not just strangers, it's actually a part of you. I was on my last visit to Moscow, I think last year, the very end of the year before, it was December. And we were walking through a metro station with my dad. And, the Moscow metro stations are very old. And we're walking through and these, grand Stalin-style metro stations. And he goes, "Vlad, you see that over there? There's just a little spot by the metro station." I go, "Yeah." And he goes, "That's the first time I saw your mum, was right there." I was like, wow, So that sense of connection to this completely foreign place, and that you come from it. And I think the secondary part to that is that they think so differently, right? They think so differently about some core things. And that means not so much that one of us is right and one of us is wrong, but more that by extension, everything I think about the world is questionable. Like they see, democracy in a certain light, but so do I. And I was so sure, and they're sure, and I think it extends into visiting places like, completely different to our own. Like Germany and Western countries are much more similar, but say in China or India, like looking at the way they see women or friendship, some things are so different and not necessarily better or worse, particularly when it comes to friendship, not so much when it comes to women, but definitely like, I observed Indian men, for instance, have this consistently, reliably, culturally, have these beautiful friendships where they're physically intimate and they'll like go out of their way for their friends. I think much more than what we do in the West. They're really like, "Oh, do you have a jumper? I'll get you a jumper. You'll be cold." And not like deep, lifelong friends, but they just think about each other in a different way. Yeah. So I think cultural exposure not only shows us how other people do things, but much more importantly, makes us question how we do things and realize that, we have a way, but not necessarily, the right way.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways we do, for treatment of women, for instance. I think the West has made enormous progress, but in other domains, not so much, So I think it's,
there's pros and cons to everywhere. Everywhere you look, there's some value to it. There's always a value to travel, I find.
Oh, enormous.
No matter what it is or where you go, there is like just inherent value in experiencing life other than your own.
Yes.
And whether even if that's in the Western world.
Oh, even in the Western world, it doesn't really matter. I think I tutored this high school girl. I've been tutoring her since she was in year 8, 4 or 5 years now. She's in year 12 now, and she's deciding what to do next year. And to me, it's like, it's no gap year. Take a year, go somewhere. It doesn't, like you say, it doesn't matter where. You become so self-sufficient. You figure out how you are in different situations. It's such a learning curve. And being in an environment that's entirely foreign is, sorry, I'm getting a phone call. Being in an environment that's totally foreign is, it forces us to confront, switch it off, to confront ourselves. Yeah, this is who I am, without people constantly telling us who we are. Oh, you're such a good this. It's just you. It's just you 24 hours. And even though I love traveling with friends, I think the most growth is traveling on your own. Just there you are in the middle of Bangkok, or there you are in, Addis Ababa, whatever it is, and it's just you, and you go out into the street, and it's just like an entirely different universe, and it's very addictive. Yeah. Here's this food that I've never tried before. I've never had this before. I have no idea what it is. I'm just gonna eat it.
And just language. Overcoming that barrier is crazy. Like, just being in another country, and so say, like, with Germany or traveling a bit through Europe, things are fairly recognizable. Like, you can still recognize certain places and institutions across the country, but just the language barrier, overcoming that is crazy. Like, it baffles me how language has developed, and there's been so much differences through it, and traveling through Germany, like, growing up with it, I could understand a bit of German because my mum would still speak it around the house, and when we would go back, she would mainly be speaking in German. So, like, I would pick up a lot as I was growing up. So I could understand, like, conversations that were happening, like, between family members. Then we go to Munich in 2013, I think. I had no idea what was being said, even though it was German. I had no idea what was being said because their accent was completely different. It completely changed over travel for like 2 hours from the city that I knew. And then we go to Munich, language is different. It just completely threw me.
Yeah. I mean, differences are astonishing even within the same country. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And same for me. My experience with India was the same. You go just a little distance and has a different language completely and a different way of doing things. And yeah, I think it's worthwhile seeing it. At least getting a taste of the world. I think it's definitely worthwhile. And I think the best time to do it is when you're young. When you're least set in your ways, when your mind is most pliable and open to new ideas and new ways of being. I think it should be compulsory if it were up to me.
I think learning a different language should be much stronger in Australia than currently what it is. So my cousins in Germany, they had German classes, which was like we have English classes. Then they had English classes. And then they had 6 months for 1 year when I was there, because I went to their school for a day to just sit in the classes and experience that. They they had they did in that year they did 6 months French and then 6 months Latin as well. And
Yeah.
that was in year, that would have been their year 8. They were doing basically 4 languages. And I was doing an elective of French.
Yes.
I chose to do French. They didn't have the choice.
Yes. I think there are good systems in the West where it's possible to do it. Like I went through a French immersion program, so year 8, 9, 10. And what they do there is all your subjects are in French.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same curriculum, but you just do maths in French, you do science in French, and it forces you to speak because they won't answer your questions, they won't read your assignments. And in 3 years, you can become more than proficient. I mean, you're fluent with an accent. And because kids are so pliable, you pick it up so easily. Yeah, so I think that could be rolled out wider. And there's good neuroscience research around speaking multiple languages as well, like how good it is for the brain. Yeah, but I think we're really lacking in Australia and in many Anglo-Saxon countries, really, with language. I don't know what the deal is, like why we feel it's so unimportant.
Yeah, English as like this superior holy grail
yeah.
nation.
And maybe a hangover from what we talked about before, that American dominance of the world. You speak English, you don't really need to speak another. You don't really.
Yeah,
It's more like a
you
catchy thing
learn
you can
our
do.
language.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that some of the studies I've seen around the cognitive decline and aging, people who speak more than one language are less likely to decline in cognitive function as they get older. And learning a language in adulthood is linked to reduced dementia and things like that. I don't know what the statistical significance of those studies are offhand, but from what I understand, they were pretty strong. Yeah, so definitely get into a language. If you take nothing from this podcast, get
Learn
into
a
a language.
Duolingo.
Yeah,
Put on the Duolingo app.
Yeah, I've actually got it. It's great.
I had it for a while, but the owl got a bit too aggressive for me.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's never been easier, right? The technology is so good now, so engaging, and animations, and they give you little rewards, and you're like, oh, it's like playing a game.
Yeah, tricks you into learning language. Deceptive like that.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Well, my friend, we've been at it for more than an hour.
For a bit. I wanted to ask one last question.
Okay.
Where to next? What's the next place you want to travel?
So there's a couple of options really that I'm interested in. Most kind of locally would be Burma. I haven't been yet, and it's kind of the where Vipassana started in the modern era. So I want to go to those centers there and spend some time. But really, where I haven't been and where I'd really like to go is Central Asia. So all the Stan countries, I call them very, very crudely. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. The primary reason, I guess, the family-related, not primary, but the family-related reason is that after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, my grandfather's family, amongst many families, was pushed out of St. Petersburg or Moscow, in his case St. Petersburg, and they kind of fled as far as they could to the far reaches of the Soviet Empire, because you don't want to get caught by the Bolsheviks for being being anyone. And so my grandfather's family fled to Uzbekistan, and so he grew up in Uzbekistan, and only came back to Moscow after the war, after he served. He was a doctor in the World War II for the Red Army. And I grew up on these stories of how wonderful Uzbekistan is, the cultural differences. They're a Muslim majority country, these beautiful traditions they have. And so that's one reason. And also that it's largely untouched by Western tourists. No one really goes out there. I'm just fascinated with how life is over there. They of course speak Russian, which is very helpful to me. So it'll be easy to get around, or easier for me than perhaps for other English-speaking Westerners. And some of the stories I've heard from mates who have been over there, who are equally adventurous in their travels, have told me that yeah, get out to Uzbekistan. It's pretty amazing. Yeah. So, and they don't have a tourism industry because they don't really
Mhm.
need it. They don't need it because they have a lot of domestic raw resource wealth like oil, gas, etc. So, and they're all authoritarian regimes, so they'd rather not let the world in anyway. So, so yeah, it'd be interesting to get out there, try their food,
Mm.
see the sights, connect with the people. Yeah, so that's the next one. But with this coronavirus situation, I don't know when that will be.
More
I
time
was
to plan.
I was meant to go to Hawaii for like at the end of third year of medicine, you have to do an international placement, and I was going to do it at the University of Hawaii in the US, but that's been cancelled. Yeah, so that's a bit of a bummer.
Mm.
But yeah, I see myself traveling for a while. I'm trying to see countries that I'm less likely to see with a family. Like if I start a family soon in my life, then I'm not going to take kids to Uzbekistan. You know.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So it's so I'm trying to do as much as I can of the crazy stuff before I have to go to like a hotel rather than some dodgy Airbnb for $3 a night.
Mm.
Yeah. I've slept in some outrageous places. I stayed in a Mumbai hostel that, I kid you not, had no walls. So I'm in the middle of Mumbai and then halfway through building and I decided to rent it. And I go to hotel.com.au and hotels.com.au. It's not a plug. And I look up the cheapest accommodation I possibly can. And I go, oh yeah, $3 a night. Solid. So I rock up and I sleep in a room. There's no wall. Just faces out to the street.
Oh my
There's just a
God.
bed. You don't want to do that with little kids or any kids.
No.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah, India's madness. Madness.
Oh dear.
Yeah. You get what you pay for, I suppose. $3 a
Yeah,
night.
three. Yeah. That's, I
Yeah.
mean, you shouldn't have been expecting a lot.
Yeah. I thought it would be disgusting, but I thought it'd be a wall.
$3 a night. $3
Yeah.
a dollar a wall. Pretty much.
$1 a wall. And the light switch to the room was in another guy's room.
Oh, nice.
Like
Jesus.
faulty wiring hanging out, and like, oh God, it was a death trap.
Oh my God. But you survived.
Yes, I'm
You
here.
made it. See, you don't need 4 walls.
Mm.
You can survive with 3.
This has been a real pleasure, Matthew. Thank you for having me
I've
on.
loved it. Thank you
Yeah.
for running the gauntlet and being the first victim
Yes,
of
yes.
LodgeCast, working title.
And even more importantly than LodgeCast, which is hard to imagine, but even more importantly, your first podcast.
It is my
Yes.
first of possibly many. I don't know.
Exactly.
Who knows? Watch out. 20
So
years time, I'll be, I don't know, hosting some other podcast show about who knows what.
I reckon
Topical,
the ABC is a good place to aim, mate.
The ABC is a brilliant place to aim. It's a place that I've aimed
Yes.
for since first watching the ABC.
Well, there's nothing stopping you.
I look up to them.
Oh, I love the
very
ABC.
valuable.
Yeah.
This isn't a plug. We're not sponsored by them, but
No. But
national broadcaster.
whenever I see funding cut to the ABC,
It hurts.
it actually physically hurts me. Like I just feel a pain inside my body that a national broadcaster is getting cuts, for political reasons. It hurts me. Anyway, separate topic, perhaps for another podcast many years in the future.
Might bring you back on.
To talk
Might bring
about
you into a Senate committee or something. Give some testimony to defend the ABC.
I will convince them. I will give an organ live.
No. You'll do the searching yourself.
I'll bring a mate.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining me.
No worries, man. Thanks, man.
Alrighty. Have a good night.
You too.